Welcome back to Directly Current. I'm your host, Max Patton. One of the biggest topics that surrounds EVs is charging them, and not just off the highway, but oftentimes in your garage or at home. That's probably going to be dealt with by your power company. And while you may not love your power bill, it's pretty important to understand how utility companies play a major space in EVs, particularly in a very grid-starved region like the Mid-Atlantic right now, which is going through a crisis of having to onboard lots of new AI and data centers and an EV transition, all while managing aging infrastructure and regulation practices. That's why I'm very excited today to speak with Dawn Neville, who is in charge of electric transportation at PSE&G, or Public Service Electric and Gas. They are the largest utility in the state of New Jersey, a very important and again, very established, let's just say, charitably, energy market. The company is over a century old, and Dawn and her team are trying to be pretty agile inside of the company and get them on board with good incentive programs to get customers on board with installing home charging and to make it as easy as possible, again, at a company that has very staid and established procedures. This is super interesting, and I think it reflects not just on themes in the Mid-Atlantic, but things we're seeing nationwide. Now, we will talk more in future episodes about rising utility prices and all of that, but that's not Dawn's wheelhouse. It's not her place to speak with at the company. That's something we have to talk more about in the future with independent analysts and others. For this episode, let's hear about the work Dawn is doing inside of PSE&G and how it's going. One quick editor's note here. I apologize for the audio quality on my end in the recording of this episode. Luckily, you mostly get to hear Dawn speak, but when I ask questions, you may notice the audio isn't ideal. Again, I apologize. We'll have that sorted out next episode. Dawn Neville from PSE&G, thank you so much for coming on Directly Current.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so first of all, can you introduce people to PSE&G's place in New Jersey in the Mid-Atlantic region and what the role of a utility like that is, just for people that don't understand how the regulation, how those companies work. Maybe they've seen a power bill, but they don't quite know the logistics of how that actually works.
Sure. Public Service Electric and Gas is New Jersey's largest electric distribution company. We distribute both electric and gas. We have 2.4 million electric customers and 1.9 million gas customers. We run down the turnpike. So we have the Port of Newark down to Trenton, Camden, and Burlington County. So we're very urban, densely populated service territory. We are regulated by the Utility Commission of New Jersey, which is the BPU, or Board of Public Utilities. And in New Jersey, we are a deregulated state, which means that our supply comes just straight through us. We're a pass-through. We don't add anything to that cost. But whatever we pay to PJM, we pass through onto our electric bill directly.
Gotcha. And when it comes to as being part of the power grid, there's been misconceptions, I would say broadly, and then now maybe it's reframed slightly because people realize also with data centers and all this other stuff, there's new loads on the grid. But nonetheless, people adding EVs to the grid, particularly in New Jersey, the Mid-Atlantic commuters, I know people love the cost of EVs, the simplicity. It's been big, the adoption for that. So that must have an impact on grid services, on people's, on the distribution upgrades, everything that's necessary for that. How do you guys approach that when it comes to EVs, which are growing in market share? Slowly now, but still growing.
Yeah. So we have a robust process of forecasting load for the next 15 years looking forward. As part of that, my team is giving the load forecast we think from increased EV adoption. We've been doing this so long now. We have, I believe, about 60 substations in the next 15 years to meet the EV load growth. We, of course, are major data center load growth as well. So all of that is analyzed in a total picture. But what's really important about our team is helping that load growth be the most efficient. So oftentimes we find customers thinking they need the fastest, most powerful, highest charger. And this is more important for commercial customers really than residential, but everybody wants the biggest, fastest charger. And if we be at the table when they're making those choices and help them realize maybe that isn't what they need, then we can help affect a moderation of the grid growth.
Yeah. And could you give an example of that kind of client? 'Cause I understand what you're talking about in that I know a lot of people with garages who would love a DC fast charger, but there's also businesses and people who are like, oh, I want to be a site host and have DC fast charging for EVs. But then you think about then use cases where level 2 charging makes sense, right? That could be overnight or during the workday. And there's so many places I know around me that could benefit from that or already have it here. So what are those kinds of different clients you're looking at who you're counseling? In some cases, hey, you guys could use a distribution upgrade, or in some cases, well, we don't need the 400 kilowatt stations yet.
Yeah, a great example of that would be like electric school buses. They have a significant amount of time they're not wheels rolling, right? So the concern is we always have to have a full battery. We don't want the kids stuck in a vehicle that ran out of electricity, ran out of charge. I understand that. But if you can really just sit down and say, You've got plenty of time to charge more slowly," that battery needs the same amount of kilowatt hours, but the speed at which you put it into the battery makes the power that you need different. And the other thing is it's actually healthier for the battery if you can charge it at a moderated rate as well. If we can get to customers, we have a lot of fleets that are starting to go electric, customers with trucks, you need to maybe lots of cars, thinking they need one DC fast charger for every single car. And instead you say, okay, let's have one DC fast charger for backups for when you need it. But instead you could actually share a level 2 charger across X number of vehicles, whatever their duty cycle. How many miles do they really drive a day? If it's a small municipality, they're not putting a lot of mileage per se onto those vehicles. And all of that is important. It's just this is a complex growing problem. And if we all come together collaboratively, I think we can make the most effective changes. But in terms of residential customers, EVs are fun and less costly to operate and maintain by a lot. But you don't need the 80 amp, 18 kilowatt charger. If you have from midnight to 6 a.m., 6 hours to charge, you can use it. If you have basically all night, every night to charge your car, you can do it at a slower rate. Again, the same number of kilowatt hours. So right now, I'm doing an experiment with the Ford 150 Lightning, trying to charge it only with level 1. And I'm doing just fine. It's just a little experiment that I'm having fun with.
I love that. And it points to a great also use case in that most people with the Lightning or most EVs commuting, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic, it's a little bit different out here in West where the distances are further and people go faster speeds. But I grew up in the Northeast and the traffic is pretty intense. People go slow. The distances, everything's more condensed. It's actually remarkably easy because I was driving my EV that I normally drive in Colorado out in the DC area, but also on through the turnpike and everywhere. I was kind of shocked at how little I needed to charge compared to other situations because it turns out that these have this lovely characteristic of the slower you go, the more efficient you are. And so if you're just doing that city commute, if you're doing that urban, suburban commute, you get a remarkable amount of range. And I love that you're saying that with a Lightning because you can imagine someone with a Model 3 or an Ioniq 6, right? Like a smaller sedan, they totally could get by in many cases with the wall out.
Yeah. And, we have a little quip about New Jersey or the Northeast that you don't measure distance in miles, you measure it in time.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. I want to touch on what you said, but though, just before we get into the residential stuff, but businesses, school buses are one thing where, like you said, they're going to have a lot of downtime. But as you look at trucking, as you look at other use cases, that's where we're starting to see like the technology get pushed. People talk about megawatt charging and all of these things. And that can be really scary from like a power perspective, but the infrastructure you need to support that. The technology, of course, is getting better. There's battery buffered chargers. There's chargers that are like able to much more flexibly split power. That's all had potential. But what do you see as trends? Do you think that we're still like a while away from that? Or do you think that technology right now is making it possible to do things that maybe you couldn't do 10 years ago? 50 kilowatt charging, I remember 10 years ago for EVs, that was the standard for DC stuff. And now many EVs charge at 300 kilowatts or more. So as you consider that, like, despite EVs continuing to be efficient, you do see some, both in the residential and the business environment, higher power, higher capacity EVs. That must change the equation a little bit, right?
Absolutely, right. The technology is it's just exploding. It was so nascent that the changes are exponential in a way. And all of that has to be factored in. You could build something today and it almost be obsolete in 6 months. But we are seeing megawatt chargers. We are seeing megawatt requests, right? Often. So we have the Port of Newark and we have the New Jersey Turnpike. The issue for us, we know our customers' patterns, and for the most part, you're getting out of the port and trying to get to a warehouse that's maybe 30, 40 miles away. So the trips are actually short, and then they go into a more long-term use case once they get out of our very urban, very dense port area. But the amount of power we need for that very dense location is exorbitant. And the Newark Airport is in there, and they're having power issues. If you've seen the news, there are greater minds than mine very busy trying to make sure we have enough distribution to meet the customer's needs.
Yeah, and obviously very difficult in, like you said, a dense area like yours that is between even more major metropolitan areas and is the home of so many people, right? So that is a difficult territory to serve, especially as you have ongoing electrification. In some cases it was government suggested, now it's just market based and it's still happening. And that's hard to meet. On the residential side though, you said like it can be more affordable for people. One of the things that like I'm noticing in lots of states across the country is that we're getting to the stage of EV adoption now where people are considering doing it from an apartment or not having a single family home with a garage, which was the classic like early adopter EV situation, in which case it makes sense. You guys have a great incentive program for installing make-ready infrastructure, getting a charger set up, but you can see how that might be more difficult for someone in an apartment or a different kind of like multi-unit living situation. So I'm just curious with New Jersey's geography, how common is that and how much of a problem is that you think makes sense for you to address?
It's really important. It's needed in order to really have an equitable access to the ability to charge a vehicle. We have quite a lot of multi-unit dwellings, and they run the gamut from the more low middle income properties to the very high end on the water overlooking the city type facilities, right? Townhouse complexes or condominium complexes. So we run the gamut, and the finances do matter. What I'm really most proud of, we started this program in 2021. We've put in so many residential chargers, but in the last 12 months, we have seen a huge uptick in our multi-unit dwelling participation. So we're really proud of that. We've put in I think in the last 24 months, over 1,000 level 2 chargers in multi-unit dwellings. I still need to try and help more the low moderate income. We need to find a way to help them more. But I'm really proud that the multi-unit dwelling program has grown so much. As you said, you need to charge at night when your car is parked. And if you're in a multi-unit dwelling, that's a little bit more difficult. So the more we can do to get chargers, whether they're level 2 at the multi-unit dwelling or DCFC really close by, one or the other. I think that's needed to be fair and equitable in terms of access to be able to drive an EV.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And as an EV owner, right, that ability to do so overnight is really what kind of, in most people's minds who don't drive an EV, they're always thinking about the charge time because it's this idea of an idle time. But every EV owner, I think most people listening to this would know that it's really a matter if I plug it in, I park it, I come back to it, right? That is the dream. And it's definitely makes sense to make that more equitable, make that more possible for people. In addition, you have this unique profile with EVs. You mentioned like load forecasting is important, right? EVs are a non-conventional load and that, okay, they're continuous for a long time, but they're also somewhat flexible because I plug in my EV, I'm going to go to sleep. I may not go to work for 10 to 12 hours. And it probably doesn't need all that time to charge unless I'm a contractor in my Lightning driving 100 miles out each day. Most people aren't that. That gives them some flexibility and allows people to save some money getting off-peak credits. But how else do you see that as potential when it comes to EVs being somewhat flexible with how you can choose to charge them, the power rate, all of that? Does that factor into the planning?
That's a huge factor. It's one of the rare discretionary loads, right? It doesn't run the same amount 24/7. That's a huge factor. We are sending pricing signals. We do have an off-peak charging credit to try and incentivize what we call good behavior. I don't like the word good, but off-peak charging behavior. And we're extremely successful with that. We're well above the national average. Right now, our customers, 92% of their charging is off-peak, our residential customers. So that's higher than the national average. Super important. I think also important is any load shaving we can do. So our general load, coincident peak load with PJM tends to be somewhere between 4 and 9 p.m., even maybe 4 to 6 p.m., somewhere in a heat wave, which is June, July, August, right? So if we can help get that charging off till 9 p.m., 10 p.m. or later. That's a huge impact. That helps everyone. That helps drive down the grid growth we have to do, which drives down overall costs for everyone.
That's the flip situation of a lot of the doom forecasting. I remember years ago, EVs being really bad for the grid can somewhat be reversed because you have this load that would otherwise just be off-peak hours that can level things out, shave off the peaks. The other thing is this bidirectional capability. And I understand that's a little bit more nascent right now. That existed with early EVs. We forgot about it for a while, I feel like, in the market. Now some EVs are coming back with that functionality. The technology is finally a little more standardized. There seem to be some vendors who actually support it. But as far as I can tell, it's still very early days. So when it comes to this idea of a bidirectional resource, having an EV as this distributed energy resource to draw from, what did that look like? How realistic does that seem for a lot of your customers?
Yeah, I think it's real important. There's the current real practicality and then the future, right? So currently, I think it would be ideal, especially in those low middle income apartment complexes or in individual homes, if we had solar, wall storage battery, and bidirectional chargers, and we could just really help customers with making their load be at a better price. If we have time of use pricing, right? Pricing signals that are less expensive on less congested times. And customers can then really save themselves some money, on a significant amount of money on their electric bill. I think that's real important. And that's currently absolutely achievable, right? With bidirectional charging, with the wall battery, and with or with. As we get to vehicle to grid, that becomes a little more complex, and we're still all working through the FERC Order 2222 and all of the interconnection rules for that. But I do see that coming and having a benefit to customers. It's just not here yet. But for example, those school buses and those school districts could be really taking advantage of the income capabilities of vehicle to grid.
Yeah. And when you're talking vehicle to grid, you're basically talking about a more aggregated form where you could realize more benefit because you could combine a fleet of EVs, whether it's a virtual fleet, like it's a neighborhood, or it's an actual fleet of school buses. That's a lot of energy you could use.
But again, these are things that are still being worked out in terms of regulations and rules and orders, both federal and statewide. I just think it's an exciting place to be working right now. As an engineer that loves to work on complex problems, this is what's in front of me, and it's exciting to try and navigate the territory.
Absolutely. And I have to give credit to you and your team, right? Like just looking on your website, I've been on a lot of Research Quest utility websites just over the last few months. And what do their EV programs look like? How good are they at conveying information to the customer? What are the vehicles you can buy? What incentives are you able to offer? You guys have a great menu of things for that, great like communications for that. What is it like within a very established company like PSE&G to build this EV program that seems to be taking off? What is that like for your team?
It has been a lot of fun, a lot of effort, a lot of dodging, bobbing and weaving. PSE&G is a 120 plus year old utility, and some of our processes are 120 plus year old in the making, because certain things in safety and health and delivering electricity are tried and true and stay that way. So then we came along, and I like to say that we had to build a startup inside 120-year-old utilities. A lot of collaboration, a lot of trying to break some rules that just were in place because they were always there, that didn't necessarily need to be there. But we really worked collaboratively with our electric operations teams, our customer operations teams. And I think it's been extremely successful. We have over 27,000 chargers, whether level 2 or level 3, that have been installed through our program.
That's awesome. And is it like, are they network chargers, or how do you have an idea of like where all the chargers are? Which ones are just private ones installed? Obviously, the public DC is infrastructure that you might permit or build yourself. But how do you know about all of the like more aggregated chargers?
So in order to we give away some make-ready funding so that you can help pay for the installation. But in order to benefit from that program and receive make-ready funding, you need to give us your charger details. You need to connect your charger so that we can see data. Those are the rules of engagement, right? So all of those, then we are able to map with extreme accuracy onto our operations system. There are, in addition, what I call ghost chargers. So that predate our program, or people that somehow didn't hear our advertisement and didn't hear about our program. But the predated ones, we think there are about 50,000 ghost chargers that we're looking to find. And we've been doing that. We're disaggregating data to try and find what looks like a charger and get that information. But yeah, in order to be in our program, you have to give us this data. And that's why we have 27,000 knowns on our system.
Yeah, and you can see how it's an interesting, like, I don't know, interesting loss of potential when you have a load of an EV and it just looks on your system like a dryer that's just on for 8 hours or something. I'm sure there's probably some clever AI way to parcel that out, but you can see the benefit of the smart charging, the flexibility that gives people. And the other anxiety I hear from people sometimes with these like connected managed charging is that like, I need this capacity by the morning. That's a thing that I'm assuming within their systems, within what you integrate with, that people can configure. They're like, I need my charge by this time.
Yeah, we don't yet have an active managed charging program. It would be something great to have in the future, but we would need regulatory approval to do that. Right now, ours is passive. We just ask, if you stay off peak, we'll give you a credit. And it's 92% of charging is off peak because of that. If it were an active program, you would say, when do you need your battery full by? And if they say 5 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, that we could moderate the peaks, because right now everyone turns their charger on at 11 at night. You set your app and you set it and forget it, and that's great. But if we could say, okay, Dawn can wait until 2 in the morning because she doesn't need to be ready until 7 in the morning, things like that. Those are the fun things that I think will be in the future.
Yeah. And just like tapping your engineering brain here for the future, as we look at some point, right, the EV growth picks up on this S curve already. I'm sure like among your PJ&G peers, you're probably already one of the more higher adoption EV territories, but it's still going to continue to grow. So what are the things you're thinking of will be like challenges or things to face as more people get more EVs? And particularly, like you said, like some people, it won't make sense to do level 2 charging. It might make sense to have that gas station model of a DC fast charger within a few minutes of them, in which case people will really appreciate high speed charging, which is hard to deliver sometimes, particularly when you have older infrastructure. So what do you think are some of the biggest kind of maybe just regulatory or just historical bottleneck and engineering challenges that have to be overcome over the next few years?
There's one that is so basic and simple, but typically are transformers in the last mile, right along your residential streets, on your utility pole. You see the transformers. They typically cool off overnight, right? So that's an important part of their long-term life cycle. And if we do push all the charging to off-peak, they don't necessarily get the cooling time they really need. So that's one thing right there. We may need more transformers just to keep them efficiently operating. Another one is the charging stations don't really have the ability to say, don't come between 4 and 6 p.m. Specifically because if you're commuting home and you want to charge your battery and then you pull it into the driveway. And those are our really critical high peak times. And that's when they're hitting with a really 350 megawatt over 20-minute spike. We'll have capacity and transmission obligations in that supply that we get through PJM that are really difficult for the DCFC stations to pay. They really do impact the ability for DCFC stations to come invest into our territory. So we need to work through all of those details. It's just ongoing. It's exciting. For me, it's exciting. As an engineer, if it was boring, I wouldn't find it fun.
Yeah, no, you definitely, I'm sure you have more than enough to keep busy with that. The last big thing I want to talk about is this exciting future proposition, because we've seen both among with your peers, the grid operators, the utilities with you guys, and even some big groups like data centers themselves, interest in battery storage for resiliency of the grid. And the interesting thing to me is that like lots of those battery chemistries, lots of that battery IP, the cost is really driven by EVs, because so up until now, they've been the biggest demand driver for that in the US. And we have still a battery belt going on. We love to talk about in this podcast, an effort to manufacture batteries in the US and to just deploy them in more places. When it comes to the ongoing like challenges of meeting existing distribution that's growing, weather challenges, all of those things, what do you think batteries might look like in the future? And I'm just speaking purely hypothetical. Obviously, you can't talk about exact plans and deployment, but how seriously do you think batteries will factor into the future of upgrading just parts of the grid and the parts that you guys get involved in?
I think they play a critical future role. I wish they played a critical present role, but as you said, there's some challenges there. We need EV chargers should be co-located with battery. We have a program coming out called the Garden State Energy Storage, which Garden State is New Jersey's nickname. And so Garden State Energy Storage Program, which will help customers install batteries. And then we can co-locate our EV chargers with batteries. We also just presented a proposed program. It's called medium heavy duty, right? Trucks and buses, where we can help support customer side storage if it helps cut down the amount of time for us to bring them power, right? The interconnection timeline is pretty long. So if we can put storage instead, then we can help them pay for that storage. The issue is it's really expensive, right? So in order to try and have customers put it in, there needs to be some financial help because it doesn't quite work out. On an individual customer basis, it doesn't make sense. But as we look at the overall grid, it does make sense to customers overall, right? So we need programs. We're working on that in this state in order to help put storage. That's important for peak shaving. It's really important for us to keep the distribution grid growth that's needed as at the most effective costs possible.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, right? This idea of like, I'll use the Powerwall as an example from Tesla, right? Like, I'm sure for some higher income customers who already have solar, that could make sense individually. But for so many individuals, that's a stretch, getting that just from an unsubsidized rate. But if you have some kind of program and incentive, because obviously there's a benefit to you guys, the more of those there are, then that could be seems like it would be much more appealing to a lot more people.
Yeah. And all of this also has to be looked at with the lens of overall affordability, right? So it's sometimes hard to say, I realize it'll be a cost now that will save in the long run. That's hard sometimes to understand. And we do have a current crisis with affordability. So we really have to be very careful, make sure our analysis makes sense, make sure it is a cost savings in the long term.
Yeah. And it's like solar and batteries themselves, or the technology still has this iterative march to improvement. So it's almost this issue of if you deploy it too early, suddenly the power walls, I'm going to use that example again, 5 years from now, we're going to make the ones today look really like low capacity or really bad. So it's what's the right time to invest? It doesn't seem to be a clear answer.
It isn't, right? It's the ongoing development of the technology makes it a difficult thing to say what's right or wrong, right? Or what's the best path, maybe not right or wrong, but what's the best path forward? So again, keep analyzing. We look at pros and cons. We look at risk reward. We look at what ifs, all of those type of engineering evaluations in order to take a look and decide really what's the best path forward.
Thank you for giving me a little bit of the thought process that goes on at PSE&G, how that's working with EVs. Just congrats again to you and your team for doing such a good job with EV programs and being so forward thinking about it, because I know there's so many, I'm not going to name names, but there are so many other companies that I think really need to start thinking about this more seriously. I appreciate it. Thank you for the time, Dawn.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here.
And that is a wrap on this episode of Directly Current. Thank you to Dawn and her team from PSE&G for letting this happen, and thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe in your podcast app of choice or YouTube. We're on all of them, links in the description. Also, make sure to check out all of the work being done by our funding organization, EVs for All America. We'll link the website for that in the description. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another great guest in the EV industry. I've been Max Patton, your host. I'll see you then.